Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the School Mentor podcast. I am your host, Myf Martinek. Now, I am so excited to finally be recording this episode. I have had a January of sick children. It seems like they've just taken turns, one after the other, of somebody being poorly. And I've attempted to record this podcast, I think about 7 or 8 times now. Each time I've had a little head walk in about 3 or 4 minutes in and they've just needed my attention. And do you know what? I'm a mum first, so that's what I've done. I've gone and given them my focus and I've kept the wheels turning at work as much as I can. And that's what I've achieved this month. And I'm actually really proud of myself for doing that. Even with all the guilt that comes with it of not performing at the absolute highest rate that I could. But do you know what? The kids are great and they're back in nursery and well today. And hopefully by the end of today, this podcast will be landing with you. So fingers crossed for everything going smoothly. Now, this podcast is going to be all about having brave conversations. And the reason I wanted to bring this up in this episode is because it has come up time and time again when I've been in school so far this month. And it's about how important the conversations we are having are in terms of building connections between maybe staff members, between staff and pupils, and how much goes unsaid and therefore can damage the connection that's there. Now, if we think about what the purpose of a conversation is, it's to build connection, regardless of what the setting is. We go into any conversation and what we want to do is understand something about someone else or understand something more, and we want our position or our thoughts, our feelings, our opinions to be understood by someone as well, right? So that's the purpose of a conversation. But what goes alongside that is that connection is built, because each time you enter a conversation and someone is able to give you information that you need, or a sense of security that you need, or just attention, that builds your connection with them. Or when you go into a conversation and those needs aren't met, then the connection is broken a little bit, maybe worn away just a little bit. And so we want to start thinking about the quality of the conversations that we're having. And what I've found are during, probably all of my years in schools, but what I've been really thinking about this month is how important bravery is when it comes to more difficult conversations. So this episode is going to be really helpful to you if you find yourself shying away from conversations that have one of 3 things. These are the kind of the categories I always think of in my head. The conversations that have got some level of conflict in them. So maybe it's a falling out with a loved one or a friend. Maybe it's dealing with a colleague at work where you just find them quite difficult. You've got very opposing views. So those conflict conversations. The next category is kind of those openly difficult topics. So those topics might be things like racism, sexism, mental health. Obviously, I spend a lot of time thinking about mental health. But those topics of conversation where you get quite nervous about saying the wrong thing, and therefore you edit yourself quite a lot in your head before you maybe say anything. You get worried about being judged, and therefore you judge yourself in advance. And then the last one are those conversations where you feel out of your depth. So it might be that you don't actually find it that uncomfortable talking about mental health, for example, but there are certain points where you would feel out of your depth in that conversation. And so these are the 3 kind of categories that I find brave conversations are needed. We need that little bit more bravery in our conversation rather than simply not really needing to think about it too much. Now, we would always have the option of just not having these conversations. So let's explore that for a second. What would it look like if you just avoided having these conversations altogether? Well, typically you would get less out of your relationship with the person that perhaps needs a conversation where the conversation is needed. So you get less out of that relationship because you won't be able to build the same level of connection. But what also happens is you don't just get to avoid it, because you will be having the conversation internally and you will be creating a level of drama and assumption in your mind about what's going on, and that will be taking up your bandwidth in itself. So it's something to think about. You can go ahead and carry on with life, avoiding difficult conversations at all costs, but there is a cost associated with that avoidance. So it's something that if we can get the skills and get some tools in place, which I want to share with you today, if we can use some tools to help you feel confident when you're having those conversations, then hopefully we can free up some of the bandwidth that you will be using overthinking or worrying about the worry, and we'll be able to free up some of that space in your mind. Now, what typically happens, before I give you these tools, I want to share with you what I see typically happening when people don't use them. And what typically happens is you enter into a conversation where it's perhaps a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps something that you don't feel that confident talking about. Someone comes to you and says that they're really struggling with something that's going on in the workplace. It's starting to affect their mental well-being. And what you will instinctively want to do is give some advice, or you'll want to talk about yourself, because these are two things that will feel quite comfortable to you. And we look for comfort as soon as we feel uncomfortable. So we will look for those opportunities where we can say, this is my area of expertise. I'm going to lean into this. I can give advice, and I can say, well, I had this experience that sounds similar to this, and this is what I did. Advice and personal anecdotes are fine. They're absolutely fine if you aren't too bothered about building connection. And if you aren't too bothered about really helping somebody, they are a good way of probably exiting the conversation quite quickly. But when we give advice, or when we focus on talking about ourselves, even sort of in a helpful anecdote way, we tend to just go back into our comfort zone and not actually be able to focus on the person who has come to us and needing some support, needing some help. So we do have those options available to us, but I want to give you 3 other tools that you could try instead of advice and anecdotes. So let's get into them. So the first tool that I want to share with you is listening with curiosity. Now, it probably doesn't come as much of a shock to you that listening is a really helpful thing to do in a conversation, but we are often so bad at doing it if we are feeling uncomfortable. Because instead of listening, what we do is we focus on, oh my God, what am I going to say next? What do they expect me to say? What if I say the wrong thing? We go into this internal turmoil in our minds trying to figure out what the next thing we should do is, and we don't actually listen all that much to the person in front of us. So it's a little mindset shift for you. When you enter into that next conversation that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, you're worried about a conflict maybe, I want you to go into it listening with curiosity, so that the goal of that conversation for you is to just find out where that person is up to. Find out more about their situation, their feelings about what's going on. When we approach our listening with curiosity, rather than approaching a conversation to get our point across, firstly, it takes the pressure off us, because you don't need to have the perfect piece of advice for them. You don't need to perform particularly. All you need to do is say, wow, that sounds interesting. Can you tell me more about that bit? That piece, that thing that you said sounds important. Can you tell me more about that? What happens when we do that is we take the pressure off ourselves, and we also stop ourselves from being judgmental, because all our focus goes into understanding that person's experience rather than trying to get enough information from them so that we can go back to our comfort zone and get our point across, right? When we listen with curiosity, we build that connection. That the whole purpose of a conversation, again, is to build a connection. So when we listen with curiosity, we are building the connection. Now, it might feel like that's all well and good, but how do you get to the point? Or how do you get to the point where you have resolved a conflict, for example? If you can listen and understand someone else's experience, then you will understand enough to resolve a conflict completely, rather than if you go in with just your own agenda, then you might be able to resolve part of it in your own mind. But if you haven't fully understood their experience, you won't be able to resolve it for both of you. So listening with curiosity first. And all that means in practical terms is asking them to tell you more. Asking them to give you more information about their experience and getting them to open up to you. So that's our first tool, listen with curiosity. One of the things that makes difficult conversations difficult is that we don't know where they're going. There's that level of uncertainty around them. And when we feel uncertain, we feel more nervous about it, right? That's a fairly obvious observation. And that is what this second tool is all about. Now, what I want to give you with this tool is essentially a map to guide you through from the start point of recognizing that it might be an uncomfortable conversation through to understanding the real depth of detail in what you need to know from the other person. And I'm gonna use this example. I'm gonna use mental well-being and the different depths of how somebody might be feeling, how severe someone's mental health might be affected, so that you have sort of a picture of how this might work. Now, I always picture the old science block at my school. Now, this is going to sound a bit strange, but the science block was called the Celtic block at my school. I grew up in Scotland, and it was this big white and green building, and it had 4 or 5 stories. I might be exaggerating that. I don't know, because it always seemed very big, but I was probably a little littler then. And there was, on each side of the building, there was these zigzag staircases. And so what you could do is, if you could sort of stand on the top level and you could holler down, and someone down the bottom would kind of hear what you were saying, because it was this big staircase and it was all open. And I always picture this when I think about having a difficult conversation. On that top level, so picture being right at the top of the staircase, on that top level is all the superficial conversations that you'll have. They're the conversations about what's going on that day, about what the weather's like, about how your pets are, all of those conversations that are easy to have, they don't cause any discomfort, any awkwardness at all. They're at the top. And right down in the basement level, you've got all the difficult things. Now, we're focusing on mental health, so let's focus on things like suicidal ideation, things like maybe self-harm. You might have all kinds of really negative emotions, difficult things to talk about, really, really difficult things to bring up in a conversation. And what really helps me is picturing that when I go into a conversation with somebody, that each of us are on our own staircase. And the likelihood is that, yes, I might be on the top level where everything's great, everything's fine, I can talk about the weather, and there really isn't much depth to what I need to talk about that day. But if it's a difficult conversation, the chances are that where the other person is and where you need to meet on that staircase is a few levels down. And so your goal in the conversation is to simply meet someone on the staircase where they are. Okay? So what does that look like in reality? It's using the questions that you ask, the statements that you make to find out where that person is. So if we picture mental well-being as everything's great, everything's fine, easy on the top level, then maybe a few levels down, there might be that they're having, a really tough time at work, or they're having issues with their partner, or, it's the school pupils who's had some really bad fallouts with friends, they're feeling really isolated, and it might go all the way down to the bottom. So as you approach that conversation, you can ask questions phrased in a slightly negative way to help you identify where that person is. So you might ask a question that sounds like, it seems like you're not getting on brilliantly with with friends in school. Can you tell me some more about that? That's you taking, one staircase down. And they might open up a little bit there, but they might say, it's kind of something else as well. And then that's your invitation to go down the next staircase. But what's really helpful for me is, in my mind, I bear in mind, I have these conversations day in, day out. I've been doing this for over 10 years now. When I have these kind of conversations, I still get nervous about sort of freaking someone out if I jump down to where I think they might be. If I think they might be in that basement, and I think they might, be suicidal. I think they might be self-harming as a way of coping with what's going on. They've got some really serious stuff going on. It terrifies me, the thought of just jumping straight into that. And it'd probably be really quite uncomfortable for them if I went from, hi, how are you doing, to talking about something as serious and as personal as one of those topics. So what helps me is picturing, right, they might be down in that basement level, but they might be somewhere else. And so if I just work my way down this staircase, if I ask them to open up about each of the difficult things to lead down a level by level, then I will know. And you do get a sense of knowing when you've met where they are, because they will then suddenly be able to give you a lot more information. It's a process that gets me from that starting point of understanding that there's a difficult thing we need to talk about. I listen with curiosity. I get them to tell me as much as they can, and then I find those points where someone is sort of highlighting that they're struggling a little bit, and I go into those areas with them, and that helps me to step down. Now, that works quite nicely with the mental health example, but it also works quite well when you are thinking about just talking to someone who you've had a conflict with. Is getting to that listening with curiosity started, getting them to open up, and then saying, well, let's talk. Can we start to talk about that thing that happened, that email that was sent, or that elephant in the room? How are you feeling about that? Okay, what's the worst parts of what's gone on there? and you start to figure out where someone is. And what that does is, remembering our purpose of conversation is to build connection, it builds the connection. And it does it in a really calm and easy way for you to navigate. Because all you need to do is think, what is the question that I can ask, or what is the statement that I can make that will take me from this level to that level? That's all you've got to do. And then you have a conversation, you carry on the conversation there, and you figure out whether you need to go one level down with your questioning. So those are our first two tools. And the last one is about when we do want to share a little bit more about our experience. Now, as I said, when we get into an uncomfortable or a difficult conversation, we tend to rely on giving advice, or we talk about ourselves and our own experience. But what we can do with that second piece can be really, really powerful. What normally happens when you talk about your own lived experience is you talk about the thing that happened and then what you did, the action that you took to rectify it or to change your situation. What gets missed is your lived experience, the feelings that you had, how you felt about yourself in that situation. So let me give you an example. I do a talk with schools that is all around managing and coaching anxiety that pupils are having. And I talk a lot about the panic attacks that I had, but I didn't used to talk about that. I used to talk about anxiety generally. And I used to say that, yes, I had panic attacks, and then this is what I did about them. And I followed that model of knowing it was a difficult conversation for people to have. I said that I had panic attacks and thought, great, they're going to know that I had panic attacks, and therefore they're going to know that I get it. But what I found happened is when I just stated it, people would sort of say, oh, right, okay. But they wouldn't necessarily open up to me. When I started to talk about how I felt, the physical sensation of having a panic attack, the thoughts that went through my mind when I had a panic attack, which were all pretty negative, and I had to be really quite humble to start sharing that, that experience with people. It was a very vulnerable experience for me, was to share that information, because it was saying that it was because I didn't feel good enough, and my panic attacks were always associated with sort of performance, and it was always to do with whether or not I felt worthy enough, or whether or not I thought that people would value what I was sharing. And when I shared that experience that I had, not the things I did to fix it, not just the fact that I had them, that is when people were able to build that connection with me. And I've observed that happening in so many different areas of life, and I've observed it happening amongst pupils, amongst staff members. When we offer anecdotes about ourselves and we offer the experience and the feeling behind it, rather than just the headline fact and the action that we took, connection is built. So when you think about the conversations that you're having, and this is really, really useful, particularly when you are mentoring someone, a fellow staff member or colleague, when you are connecting with someone in that way, think about how you are sharing your wisdom, and see if you can do more to share your experience rather than just the factual sort of circumstance and then the action that you took. Because when you add in those thoughts and feelings in the middle, that is when somebody can really understand more about you and therefore they can reflect on how that would be relevant in their lives, and they're more willing to accept that the actions you took might be relevant for them, or they're more willing to open up with you about their experience and their feelings and thoughts, because you've built that place of safety for them to do so, because you've chosen to be vulnerable and you've taken that brave step. So those are the 3 tools that I would love for you to just give it a go. Think of one of them and try it on for size in the next challenging conversation that you need to have. The one thing I would like to close with is that every time we avoid having a brave conversation, I've talked about suicide today, every time that we are worried about someone and think that they might be struggling, possibly to the point of being suicidal, but we don't ask them, or we don't start the conversation, we skirt around it, we leave it as an elephant in the room, we confirm to them that this is a taboo subject and they don't get to talk about it. It doesn't matter how many times we say it's okay to not be okay. It doesn't matter how many posters go on the wall or how many PSHE conversations are had about this stuff. Unless we are living it in the conversations that we are having, unless we are brave enough to take those steps down, to really be curious when we're listening to people, and to share that experience and those feelings and thoughts that we've had when we want to give kind of our advice and our experience. Unless we do those things, we leave all of these topics of conversation as taboo, as awkward, as things that we just don't talk about. So my challenge to you today is to notice the next time that you find yourself in one of these situations where you've got this conversation coming up, or you notice that, hang on a second, I'm in one of these conversations where typically I am drawn to giving advice or just telling an anecdote because it will make me feel comfortable. See if you can pause. See if you could just do some listening. See if you could use that stepping process to figure out how someone else is feeling. Or maybe when you do give your lived experience and you tell them about an experience that you've had, focusing in on the thoughts and the feelings that you had and that piece of it, that vulnerable piece of it, rather than just the actions that you took. So that's everything for today. In the next few episodes, I'm going to focus in a little bit on what This Is Me is all about. This business was set up all around brave conversations, actually. So it's a lovely place to start this year on, 2024. It's a lovely place for me to start this year. But I want to actually start sharing a little bit more of the content of how I train with schools, with both staff and with pupils, and hopefully give you some ideas to take into your school about how you can take these conversations and make them happen in your setting, and how you could make this actually come to life in your school. So please tune in to the next few episodes where we're going to dive into those things. But for now, thank you so much. Sending all my best wishes for the year ahead, even though we're on the 1st of Feb, and I will see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the School Mentor Podcast. We hope you're leaving today's episode feeling inspired to create a stronger, more connected school community. To access more resources, be sure to visit our website at this-is-me.uk. It would mean the world to us if you subscribed, rated and reviewed our podcast, and shared it with your fellow educators. Until next time, thank you for inspiring, mentoring, and changing the lives of the young people in your community.